At 9 years old, Baldwin IV was playing with other noble children when they began pinching each other's arms, a normal childhood game. The other boys cried out in pain, but Baldwin felt nothing. His tutor, William of Tyre, watched in growing horror as he realized that half the boy's right arm was completely numb. What William had discovered was the first sign of leprosy, a disease so feared in medieval times that it was considered a living death. By the time Baldwin ascended to the throne of Jerusalem at 13, his body had already begun its slow descent into horror, transforming one of the most beautiful princes in Christendom into a decaying, eyeless shell who would rule while his flesh literally crumbled away. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a sick boy becoming king. It's about how a child destined for greatness became a living nightmare, fighting battles while blind, commanding armies while his face dissolved, and holding together a kingdom, even as his own body betrayed him in the most gruesome ways imaginable. What you'll discover about Baldwin's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, power, and the price of keeping a crown when your own flesh becomes your enemy. The year was 1174, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood as Christianity's most precious jewel in the Holy Land. For 75 years, Crusader knights had held this sacred territory against the growing power of Islam, but now they faced their greatest challenge yet: Saladin, the brilliant Muslim leader who had unified Egypt and Syria. Into this world of constant warfare and religious fervor stepped Baldwin IV, a 13-year-old boy who should have been the perfect Christian king. Born in 1161 to King Amalric I and Queen Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin had been blessed with everything a medieval prince could want: noble birth, keen intelligence, and striking good looks that made him the talk of the royal court. Contemporary accounts describe him as exceptionally handsome, with the kind of beauty that seemed to promise a golden future. He was quick-witted, an excellent student, and showed remarkable skill at horsemanship, despite his growing disability. But God, it seemed, had other plans. The disease that would define Baldwin's reign had been diagnosed when he was just a child, though the full implications wouldn't become clear until he was already wearing the crown. Medieval physicians understood so little about leprosy that they initially hesitated to even name it, knowing that such a diagnosis would essentially end Baldwin's life before it had truly begun. In an age when lepers were forced to ring bells to announce their presence, when they were considered spiritually unclean and legally dead, the idea of a leprous king was almost inconceivable. Yet Baldwin was crowned anyway, because the alternative was worse. The Kingdom of Jerusalem desperately needed a leader, and Baldwin was the only legitimate heir. His nobles believed that divine providence would either cure him or that he would die quickly, allowing for a more suitable succession. They were wrong on both counts. From his first day as king, Baldwin faced a cruel irony. As his body began to fail, his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbroken. He possessed all the qualities of a great ruler: tactical genius, political acumen, and an unshakable sense of duty, trapped within a body that was slowly consuming itself from the inside out. The psychological torment of Baldwin's condition went far beyond the physical pain. Unlike other medieval kings who could hide their ailments behind palace walls, Baldwin's leprosy made secrecy impossible. Every public appearance became a test of courage as courtiers and subjects struggled to hide their revulsion. William of Tyre, who had discovered the first symptoms, wrote with barely concealed anguish. It grew more serious each day, especially injuring his hands and feet and his face, so that his subjects were distressed whenever they looked at him. Baldwin was acutely aware of the horror he inspired. Court records reveal that he ordered windows to be kept closed during meetings, not for his own comfort, but to prevent the smell of his rotting flesh from offending others. He insisted on wearing gloves at all times, even though his hands had become so deformed that they were barely functional. The young king, who should have been courting potential wives and producing heirs instead, watched helplessly as his disease made him unmarriageable and condemned his dynasty to die with him. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his condition. Medieval kingship was fundamentally about physical presence, leading armies, attending ceremonies, being seen by subjects as the embodiment of royal power. Baldwin was forced to perform these duties while his body visibly deteriorated. He could see the pity and disgust in people's eyes, feel their reluctance to come too close, sense their whispered conversations about his condition. More devastating still was the knowledge that his suffering had no purpose. Medieval Christians believed that suffering could bring spiritual redemption, but Baldwin's leprosy seemed to serve no higher purpose. He wasn't being punished for sin. He had contracted the disease as an innocent child. He wasn't being tested by God. The disease only grew worse over time. He was simply wasting away, and everyone around him was waiting for him to die. Baldwin's courtiers developed elaborate protocols to manage his condition. Special attendants were assigned to help him dress, eat, and perform basic functions as his hands became increasingly useless. His armor had to be specially modified to accommodate his deteriorating frame. Eventually, he required assistance even to mount his horse, the most basic requirement of medieval kingship. The psychological pressure intensified as Baldwin realized that his nobles were beginning to plan for his death. Succession debates raged openly in his presence, with various factions positioning themselves for the coming power struggle. The king was forced to listen to discussions about his own replacement while he was still desperately trying to rule effectively. The progression of Baldwin's leprosy followed a horrific pattern that medieval physicians documented with clinical precision. What had begun as simple numbness in his right arm gradually spread throughout his form, each new symptom marking another step toward his inevitable doom. By his late teens, Baldwin's face had begun to change. The disease attacked his facial nerves, causing his features to become increasingly distorted. His nose started to collapse inward, creating a grotesque depression where his profile should have been. His lips became thick and uneven, making speech increasingly difficult. Contemporary accounts describe how his once beautiful face became a mask of suffering that frightened even his closest advisors. His hands, which had once wielded swords and signed royal decrees with elegant script, transformed into gnarled claws. The bones became visible through his thin, discolored skin, which took on a sickly yellow-green hue. His fingers, deformed beyond recognition, could no longer grip objects properly. Royal scribes had to guide his hand when important documents required his signature, and even then, the results were often illegible. The disease's assault on his extremities was particularly cruel. His feet became so deformed that he could no longer walk unassisted. Court records describe how attendants had to carry him from room to room, a humiliating necessity for a king who had once been known for his athletic prowess. When he insisted on mounting his horse to lead armies, servants had to physically lift him into the saddle and tie him in place. But perhaps the most devastating symptom was the loss of his sight. Baldwin's inability to blink properly, caused by nerve damage, led to his corneas drying out and ulcerating. Contemporary physicians described how his eyes became clouded and then completely white, leaving him blind in his early 20s. The young king, who had once been able to read the battlefield with tactical precision, was reduced to navigating his own palace by touch and memory. The smell of his decomposing flesh became legendary among his contemporaries. Despite the best efforts of his attendants, who bathed him frequently and applied expensive perfumes, the odor of tissue breakdown permeated his chambers. Visitors to the royal court learned to bring scented handkerchiefs, and many reported feeling nauseous in the king's presence. Baldwin, aware of this effect, increasingly isolated himself, conducting business through intermediaries when possible. Ulcers began appearing across his frame, starting small but gradually expanding into open wounds that never healed. These sores, described by court physicians as covered with ulcerations, became breeding grounds for infection. The king's body was essentially devouring itself from within, and no medieval remedy could stop the progression. William of Tyre's accounts become increasingly disturbing as they chronicle Baldwin's physical collapse. He was scarcely able to stand up and he might collapse altogether. He had lost his sight, and his extremities were covered with ulcerations, so that he was unable to use either his hands or his feet. This wasn't merely illness, it was a systematic destruction of everything that made Baldwin human. The most remarkable aspect of Baldwin's reign was his refusal to surrender to his condition. Even as his body failed, he continued to lead military campaigns with a determination that bordered on supernatural. His greatest triumph came in 1177 at the Battle of Montgisard, where he achieved what many considered impossible: a crushing defeat of Saladin's supposedly invincible army. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance, executed by a blind, crippled teenager. Baldwin, now unable to see the battlefield, had to rely on detailed verbal reports from his commanders to understand the enemy's movements. Despite being in constant pain and barely able to sit upright in his saddle, he personally led the charge that shattered Saladin's forces. Contemporary accounts describe how the sight of their leprous king leading them into battle inspired his soldiers to superhuman efforts. The psychological impact on the enemy was equally devastating. Saladin's troops, many of whom had never seen a leprous person before, were reportedly horrified by Baldwin's appearance. The image of a decaying, eyeless king leading a cavalry charge became a nightmare that haunted Muslim chroniclers for years. Some Islamic accounts describe Baldwin as a demon or supernatural being, unable to believe that a living human could appear so monstrous yet fight so effectively. But victory came at a terrible cost. The physical strain of battle accelerated Baldwin's bodily wasting. After Montgisard, court physicians noted that his condition worsened dramatically. The excitement of combat, the stress of command, and the physical demands of wearing armor and controlling a warhorse while blind pushed his failing frame beyond its limits. Baldwin's later military campaigns became increasingly desperate affairs. By 1182, he could no longer mount a horse unassisted and had to be carried to battle in a litter suspended between two horses. The sight of their king being transported like a sick child was demoralizing to his troops. But Baldwin's tactical genius remained intact. Even blind and immobilized, he continued to outmaneuver Saladin's forces through superior strategy and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Battle of Leper in 1182 demonstrated Baldwin's continued military effectiveness despite his horrific condition. Contemporary accounts describe how he was carried onto the battlefield on his litter, his face covered by a veil to hide his deteriorating features, but his voice still strong enough to rally his troops. The victory was hard won, but it proved that Baldwin's mind remained sharp even as his body crumbled. His final military action came in 1183 when Saladin besieged the fortress of Kerak. Baldwin, now barely able to speak and completely blind, insisted on leading the relief expedition personally. Carried in his litter at the head of the army, he advanced toward the enemy with the same determination he had shown throughout his reign. The sight of the leprous king's approach was enough to force Saladin to lift the siege, proving that Baldwin's reputation as a warrior king remained intact, even in his final extremity. As Baldwin's condition worsened, the political vultures began circling. The king's inability to produce an heir due to his leprosy had created a succession crisis that consumed the kingdom's energy and resources. Various factions maneuvered for position, each believing they could manipulate the dying king to their advantage. Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, became the focal point of these machinations. Her marriage to Guy of Lusignan was arranged primarily to strengthen the succession, but Guy proved to be a weak and unpopular leader. Baldwin, despite his failing health, recognized Guy's inadequacy and began working to exclude him from power. The dying king's last months were consumed by desperate attempts to secure a competent successor. The most heartbreaking aspect of this crisis was Baldwin's relationship with his young nephew, Baldwin IV. The boy, son of Sibylla and her first husband, represented the kingdom's future, but he was still a child. Baldwin IV made the painful decision to crown his nephew as co-king in 1183, essentially acknowledging that his own death was imminent. The ceremony was a tragic spectacle, a blind, rotting king placing a crown on a healthy child's head, symbolically passing the torch to the next generation. Baldwin's political maneuvering during his final years revealed the sharp mind trapped within his deteriorating body. He played various factions against each other, using his royal authority to prevent any single group from gaining too much power. Even as he lay dying, he continued to issue orders and make strategic decisions that would affect the kingdom long after his death. The king's inner circle was forced to witness his slow dissolution while maintaining the pretense of normal governance. Court records from this period reveal the strain on everyone involved. Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who had returned to court to care for her dying son, reportedly broke down in tears during public ceremonies. His advisors struggled to interpret his increasingly slurred speech and communicate his wishes to subordinates. Perhaps most cruel was the knowledge that Baldwin's death would likely doom the kingdom he had fought so hard to preserve. His successors lacked his tactical genius and political skill. The various factions that he had held together through force of personality would inevitably tear the kingdom apart once his restraining influence was removed. Baldwin could see this future clearly, adding psychological torment to his physical suffering. Baldwin's final illness began in late 1184, with a fever that his physicians initially hoped he would survive, as he had similar episodes before. But this time was different. The fever, likely caused by septicemia from his infected ulcers, ravaged his already weakened body with unprecedented severity. Contemporary accounts describe how his temperature soared, causing delirium and periods of unconsciousness. The young king's last lucid moments were spent in frantic attempts to secure his kingdom's future. He summoned the High Court to his bedside, forcing himself to remain conscious long enough to arrange the regency for his nephew. Witnesses described the horrific scene. Baldwin, blind and barely able to speak, propped up in bed, while his body trembled with fever, struggling to articulate his final wishes for the kingdom's governance. His death chamber became a scene of medieval horror. The smell of his infected flesh, now in advanced stages of decomposition, was so overwhelming that attendants had to work in shifts. Perfumed oils and incense could no longer mask the odor of living death. Baldwin's form was quite literally collapsing while he still breathed, his infected ulcers having spread to cover most of his extremities. The king's final days were marked by periods of delirium, where he would call out orders to long-dead knights or try to rise from his bed to lead non-existent armies. His fevered mind, still sharp despite his body's failure, seemed trapped in battles from his glorious past. Attendants reported hearing him repeatedly whisper tactical instructions or cry out warnings to soldiers who existed only in his memories. Baldwin's death, when it finally came in March 1185, was almost anticlimactic after years of anticipated doom. Contemporary accounts suggest he died of septicemia, his body finally succumbing to the infections that had been consuming him for months. He was only 24 years old, but his appearance was that of an ancient man ravaged by disease and pain. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the full extent of his transformation. Attendants preparing his remains for burial were reportedly shocked by the advanced state of tissue breakdown. His flesh had become so fragile that it began to fall away at the slightest touch. The beautiful prince who had once been the pride of Jerusalem was reduced to a putrid corpse that could barely be handled for burial preparations. The ultimate irony of Baldwin IV's story lies not in his death, but in what happened after. The kingdom he had fought so desperately to preserve collapsed almost immediately after his passing. His nephew Baldwin V died within a year, probably from the same disease that had killed his uncle. The succession crisis that Baldwin had tried to prevent exploded into civil war, with various factions tearing the kingdom apart. Just 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin achieved what he had never managed while facing the Leper king: the complete conquest of Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 destroyed the Crusader army and ended Christian rule in the Holy Land. The kingdom that Baldwin had held together through sheer force of will crumbled within months of losing his leadership. Modern historians have recognized Baldwin IV as one of the most remarkable rulers in medieval history. His military victories over Saladin were genuine achievements that demonstrated exceptional tactical skill and personal courage. His political management of a fractious nobility showed sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. His economic policies helped the kingdom prosper even during wartime. Yet Baldwin is remembered primarily for his disease rather than his achievements. The tragedy of his story is that his very success in overcoming his condition has been overshadowed by the horror of his appearance. Medieval chroniclers, despite their admiration for his courage, couldn't resist dwelling on the gruesome details of his physical disintegration. The medical analysis of Baldwin's condition by modern physicians has revealed just how extraordinary his accomplishments were. To rule effectively while suffering from advanced leprosy would have required superhuman determination. To lead armies while blind and partially paralyzed defied all reasonable expectations. To maintain political authority while physically repulsive challenged the very foundations of medieval kingship. Baldwin's story serves as a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. His reign proved that physical beauty and health, while advantageous, are not prerequisites for effective leadership. His legacy challenges our assumptions about disability, showing that even the most severe physical limitations cannot necessarily prevent someone from achieving their goals. The story of Baldwin IV forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own prejudices and assumptions. In our modern world, where physical appearance and health are often seen as indicators of capability, Baldwin's reign stands as a powerful counterexample. His story demonstrates that human potential cannot be measured by physical condition alone. The parallels between Baldwin's medieval struggles and modern challenges are striking. His fight against discrimination based on physical appearance resonates with contemporary disability rights movements. His refusal to be defined by his condition offers inspiration to anyone facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. His leadership during times of crisis provides lessons for modern leaders dealing with their own challenges. Perhaps most importantly, Baldwin's story reminds us that dignity and courage can be maintained even in the face of ultimate degradation. His refusal to surrender to despair, his continued service to his people despite personal suffering, and his determination to fulfill his duties, regardless of the cost, represent the highest ideals of human behavior. The medical horror of Baldwin's condition, the systematic destruction of his form while his mind remained sharp, serves as a metaphor for the human condition itself. We are all, in our own ways, fighting against the limitations of our physical existence. Baldwin's story shows us that how we respond to these limitations defines us more than the limitations themselves. In the end, the terrifying final days of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, become a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. His reign proved that true power comes not from physical perfection, but from strength of character, that real beauty lies not in appearance, but in actions, and that genuine nobility is measured not by birth, but by behavior in the face of adversity. Baldwin IV died as he had lived, fighting against impossible odds, serving his people despite personal cost, and proving that sometimes the most broken vessels can hold the greatest treasures. His legacy reminds us that in our darkest moments, when our bodies fail and our circumstances seem hopeless, we still possess the power to choose how we respond, and that choice more than any physical condition, defines who we truly are.